I'm Margot Neale. I'm the Principal Indigenous Advisor at the National Museum of Australia and the Senior Indigenous Curator. I've been there for since it opened actually, 14 years. I've been engaged clearly with a lot of projects, more recently with a songlines project, which is called Alive with the Dreaming, songlines of the Western Desert. But over the years, or let's say about that, there are lots of interesting structural and organisational factors in relation to values, organisation and modes of delivery of content and governance situations that museums, the Western Museum could learn a lot from. For example, while the Western Museum continues to have pyramidal or hierarchical structures, they're always can confine people and knowledge into silos. And then there's line of management, and that is not at all conducive to the interactivity and inclusion that their museums, or Western institutions in general, not just museums, espouse to be their values. But if they actually took on, and there's a lot of reasons why they should take on an Indigenous mode of knowledge system, is if museums, and I mean that generically, art galleries, museums and other Western cultural places, if they want to take on Indigenous people and Indigenous material and run Indigenous galleries and programs, then it is beholden upon them to actually take on the cultural values as well to some extent. So there's an imperative there, I think, an ethical and moral imperative there, quite apart from the fact the songlines, which are, as I said, a knowledge system, but they're sort of corridors or pathways of knowledge that crisscross this continent, and they are also about creating, retaining and transmitting knowledge for future generations. Of course, the songlines, they're embedded into the features of land. In the Western Archive, they're in sort of wooden structures that appear to be static, studded around on top of the land. But the thing about the songlines is because of its interconnectivity, it means that people and objects can work through in a flatter structure where interactivity is possible. It's also like the governance structures are such that the knowledge is shared between lots of different individuals who have lots of different custodial rights. So in an institution, you can easily do that. And rather than hierarchical, everybody has roles and responsibilities across the museum. It doesn't mean there's no hierarchy, but there's much more fluidity between those sites. But it's almost like if you take on like I said, objects and people without taking on the culture that comes with it. It's like taking the bricks off a house and not taking the infrastructure or the frame of the house. So then you have this pile of bricks and you say, well, this is a house. Well, clearly it's not, because the structure that informs the constellation or the laying of those bricks is not there. So you're easily getting into tokenism, and you get into a whole range of other problems too. But going back into the structure, why aren't Indigenous people in institutions working from directorial, executive and down? As far as I know, there's no Indigenous people in the directorate level. If in fact the skills Indigenous people have are not so-called executive, at least they're cultural. So we could do what Te Papa does, and as far as I know, the only one. We have a cultural director as well as a management director, and you could actually shadow that through executive as well. Not only does it give a stepping stone up for other people, but it also draws on the particular expertise that you bring, which is more valuable to the institution than you converting into a Western bureaucrat. There's a whole range of other things like what's still happening, and I'm not being disrespectful to museums clearly, because I've been in the field for years, but these are just other ways of thinking about remapping the terrain of the museum to be more conducive to not only its own espoused values of inclusivity and interactivity and respect for Indigenous culture, but also to its own human values, Indigenous values as well as non-Indigenous values. Because currently it's still this system, and we've come a long way, so don't get me wrong, but there's still this system of Indigenous people in Indigenous-only areas. Now, some people like it that way, but for me, I think that's terribly limiting and silo-ish and isn't about working together at all, and it creates a culture of them and us. Some are there in a sort of a golden cage thing. It's like, you know, these are our Aboriginal people. It's like trophies. It's like special treatment. And other times it's sort of like the roped-off section one would see in the theatres of, you know, 50s and 60s or 70s, where it's a sort of a tick the box, we have them, but we don't really give them much attention. And why not? Why are not Indigenous people, say in art galleries, you've got the Indigenous Art Department, the Asian Art Department, Pacific, International, and so on. You will never see Indigenous people working in any of those other departments except the Indigenous Department. But you will see, you know, non-Indigenous, Asians, all sorts of other cultural people work in Indigenous departments. Now, I know that's something to do with numbers. I mean, we can't discount the fact that we may not have enough to go around, but there doesn't seem to even be a pathway for that sideways spread. Same in museums that I've worked at. I've never seen an Indigenous person working in the Australian history section. Well, I hesitate to say that because Indigenous history is pretty well Australian history, but there's sections which are almost called Australian history, and then there's sections called Indigenous cultures programs or Indigenous programs, and there's still this barrier. Now, I know there's a lot of very good people and very good directors and people I work with who see that anomaly. And you can't just change one thing. It has to be a suite of changes. So you have to re-look at the very core foundational structures of the museum. And once you sort that out, all the others will kind of fall into shape. It'll be a much more normalised environment that we can all actually truly share Australia's history.